begin the program with the recitation of the Holy Quran. Please welcome al-Modarresi with a loud salawat ala Muhammad wa ali Muhammad.
أعوذ بالله من الشيطان الرجيم. بسم الله الرحمن الرحيم. وقال الذين اتبعوا لو أن لنا كرة فنتبرأ منهم كما تبرأوا منا كذلك يريهم الله أعمالهم حسرات عليهم وما هم بخارجين من النار. يا أيها الناس كلوا مما في الأرض حلالا طيبا ولا تتبعوا خطوات الشيطان إنه لكم عدو مبين. إنما يأمركم بالسوء والفحشاء وأن تقولوا على الله ما لا تعلمون. وإذا قيل لهم اتبعوا ما أنزل الله قالوا بل نتبع ما ألفينا عليه آباءنا أولو كان آباؤهم لا يعقلون شيئا ولا يهتدون. ومثل الذين كفروا كمثل الذي ينعق بما لا يسمع إلا دعاء ونداء صم بكم عمي فهم لا يعقلون. يا أيها الذين آمنوا كلوا من طيبات ما رزقناكم واشكروا لله إن كنتم إياه تعبدون. إنما حرم عليكم الميتة والدم ولحم الخنزير وما أهل به لغير الله فمن اضطر غير باغ ولا عاد فلا إثم عليه إن الله غفور رحيم. إن الذين يكتمون ما أنزل الله من الكتاب ويشترون به ثمنا قليلا أولئك ما يأكلون في بطونهم إلا النار ولا يكلمهم الله يوم القيامة ولا يزكيهم ولهم عذاب أليم. صدق الله العلي العظيم.
Today we're very fortunate to have Shaykh Jaffer Ladak, who will be speaking to us about his new book, The Pure Life, introducing the new publication on nutrition and lifestyle from the Quran and Ahadith. Let's welcome him with Salaat ala Muhammad wa al-Muhammad. Shaykh Jaffer holds a master's degree in Islamic Law from the Islamic College with his dissertation on an Islamic theory of global citizenship. He's authored a number of books, including The Hidden Treasure, The Ways of the Righteous, A Pure Land, Islamic History of Yemen, and A Star Amongst the Stars, a biography of Jabir ibn Abdullah. And he's an author of many articles and publications. He's spoken here on many occasions, and he's the Imam of Bab al-Ilm Center. Let's welcome him again. Salaat ala Muhammad wa al-Muhammad.
Allahumma salli ala. أعوذ بالله من الشيطان الرجيم. بسم الله الرحمن الرحيم. الحمد لله رب العالمين. الحمد لله الذي هدانا لهذا وما كنا لنهتدي لولا أن هدانا الله. والصلاة والسلام على أشرف الأنبياء والمرسلين خاتم النبيين سيدنا الممجد بشير المصدق المصطفى الأمجد محمود الأحمد أبي القاسم محمد. اللهم صل على محمد وعلى أهل بيته الطيبين الطاهرين المعصومين ولعنة الله على الظالمين من الأولين والآخرين. أما بعد، فقد قال الله سبحانه وتعالى في كتابه المجيد وفرقانه الحميد وقوله الحق بسم الله الرحمن الرحيم على سرر موضونة متكئين عليها متقابلين يطوف عليهم ولدان مخلدون بأكواب وأباريق وكأس من معين لا يصدعون عنها ولا ينزفون وفاكهة مما يتخيرون ولحم طير مما يشتهون آمنا بالله صدق الله العلي العظيم صلوا على محمد وآل محمد اللهم صل على Awaited Savior of Humanity, Imam al-Mahdi alayhi salam, my respected teachers, elders, brothers and sisters, Assalamu alaikum jami'an wa rahmatullahi wa barakatuh. عظم الله أجورنا وأجوركم بمصابنا أبي عبد الله الحسين صلوات الله وسلامه عليه. Very grateful for the opportunity to be able to sit before you again this evening and to be able to introduce to you all the publication, the Pure Life, Hayatun Tayyiba, which is a translation and a commentary of the work of Grand Ayatollah Syed Taqi al-Modarresi, the marja of the city of Kerbala. I want to be able to introduce to you this work that we've tried to bring to the English-speaking world. The reasons for why we have translated it and actually published it, and some of the key features that you'll find available in this work, and why we find it to be such an important work for the English-speaking audience to partake in. To start with, why we translated this work, and actually where the inspiration came about for us to be able to work with this particular text. When I was just actually reading about the topic around health, nutrition, diet, not from the Islamic perspective, but generally from the perspective of what is available there, one of the most influential studies is actually called the China study, which looks at the relationship between sort of the food industries and the health outcomes that are available to us. It's actually the largest study of its kind by two brothers, T.M. and T.C. Campbell. And it's considered to be probably the most important study available to us till date. And as I started to look at this work, I found more literature available in the Sunni world when it came to sort of Islamic diet, Islamic nutrition, and the relationship between the traditional literature that we have and a modern scientific interpretation and application of those ayat and ahadith. Particularly, I came across the works of Sheikh Hamza Yusuf from the United States, and he's someone for at least 2 decades has been emphasizing the importance of having a good diet, a good nutritional cycle in our lifestyle. He often tells us things like, don't have fast food. Food is not supposed to be eaten fast. Eat it slowly. Enjoy it, savor it, understand where it's come from, understand what it's doing to your body. And he has a number of different lectures on sort of Islamic nutritional values. Now, as I was studying the works of Ayatollah al-Modarresi, one of the works that he's recently published in the last decade is called Hayatun Tayyiba, and it is a multi-volume work which is sort of one of his contributions to the evolution of the abwab, the chapters of fiqh and jurisprudence. Ayatollah al-Modarresi has probably provided 2 great evolutions in the Shi'i world when it comes to fiqh jurisprudence. One is that he's developed a very masterful maqasid al-sharia, sort of the higher goals and intents of the sharia, which is normally considered to be a Sunni framework, whereas he's looked at this from a Shia perspective and has probably written the most work on it from a Shia perspective. The second thing that he's contributed from the evolutionary perspective of Shi'i ijtihad is this work Hayatun Tayyiba, and he's sort of understood the idea that fiqh is not limited to the traditional abwab that we have seen. Normally we think of the chapters of fiqh as sort of starting with bulugh and taqleed, and then going to tahara and salah and so on and so forth. He expands this body of work into thinking about what is the fiqh, for example, of the house and how the house itself should be organized. What is the fiqh, for example, of how a government should be organized, how the fiqh of maybe a healthcare system should be organized. And these sorts of abwab are available in Hayatun Tayyibah, in the idea that a life which is tayyib, which is pure, and above just simply being at the level of halal, needs to have a holistic, integrated understanding of what life is concerned with. And so he looks at all of these different aspects of life and creates a bab of ijtihad around these sorts of areas of life. One of them was nutrition and diet and lifestyle from the Islamic perspective. And so in this particular chapter, he draws upon ayat and ahadith and then does his istidlal to be able to come to his conclusions as to the way an Islamic or an optimum Islamic lifestyle in terms of diet and nutrition should be lived. And so having come across this work and not found anything sufficient in the English Shi'i language, and how much emphasis there is today on the importance of a healthy diet, and sort of the way in which we have duties and responsibilities to the environment, we decided to be able to translate this work into English and bring it to the English-speaking audience. One of my friends, Zain Ali Panjwani, who has now moved to Dubai, used to live here in London and then Birmingham. He has he actually has an organization called 12th Health. And he and I have been speaking for a long time about the importance of diet in Islam and sort of this holistic framework or a spiritual diet in Islam. And being an osteopath and someone who is very, he is very committed to this cause, far more than I am, to be honest with you, we have been speaking about how we can bring this work to fruition. And so what we have in this work is the translation of Ayatollah Modarresi's works, but then he and I, Zain Ali, have commented upon this work. His commentary comes at it from the perspective of science and a very contemporary literature review when it comes to how science is commenting and applying some of those principles that we're finding within the Quran and Ahadith. And my contribution is to try to bring together some more works from the traditional Islamic perspective that Ayatollah Modarresi has not mentioned in his works. So that's the preface of the book and sort of what inspired us to bring the book together. Now you heard some of the verses so beautifully recited, and what I want to mention is that the preface of the work, as you know, it's called Hayatun Tayyibah, that we should be eating from not just halal but tayyib. And you heard those verses, or some of those verses from Surah Al-Baqarah. Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala says that we should eat from the earth. And then you can see, it's interesting that Allah actually brings in وَلَا تَتَّبِعُ خُطَوَاتِ الشَّيْطَانِ. Do not follow the footsteps of shaitan. Clearly showing us that there's immediately a relationship between the food that we consume and the potential to be able to follow the works of shaitan. And of course, it's not just limited here to the idea of what is halal and haram. The idea of a spiritual diet goes far more than simply this idea. And what I want to show you from the preface of the work is that Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala actually tells us that we are expected, when it comes to the topic of diet and nutrition in Islam, is actually to be able to live a lifestyle that is comparable to that of the prophets of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. The expectation that is upon the prophets to live a certain lifestyle, we are told to live exactly the same lifestyle in the Quran. Now, why is this important? Because when it comes to halal and tayyib, we normally will say something akin to that the level of the lifestyle that the prophets have is, of course, the most perfect and pure lifestyle. It's not possible for us to be able to live that sort of lifestyle. Or one might imagine that because we are not prophets, we are not expected to live the lifestyle of prophets. What is actually interesting from the Quranic perspective when it comes to specifically eating and having a diet and a nutritious lifestyle, Allah says exactly the same words to the prophets as He does to the believers. Not telling the prophets that they should lower their lifestyle to the way in which maybe I live, rather that we should be pulling ourselves up to the level that prophets themselves are actually living their lifestyle, which is quite incredible, telling us that the ordinary human being, the non-prophetic human being, is actually expected to live a prophetic lifestyle. This is mentioned in the Quran, and we mention this in the preface of the work. So I'll give you a couple of ayat to be able to appreciate. So for example, in chapter number 23, verse number 51 of the Quran, Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala addresses the messengers. Bismillahir Rahmanir Rahim. Ya ayyuhar rusul, O messengers, kulu min at-tayyibat, eat from the tayyibat. Or maybe even if we don't translate literally kulu, we can say partake from the tayyibat. So this goes wider than simply eating, which is something very important I'm going to come to in a minute when it talks about a spiritual diet or a holistic diet. That it's not simply consumption, literally what I eat. It's actually much more than that. Kulu min at-tayyibat, partake from the pure things. Wa'amalu salihan, inni bima ta'maluna alim. And do good, I know all that you do. So Allah sets the bar for prophets and messengers to partake in that which is pure. In the Quran, Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala tells the believers exactly the same words, stating that the expectation that is upon us is the same expectation that is upon the messengers of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. For example, the verses that you heard so beautifully recited, Surah Al-Baqarah, verse 172, Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala says, Bismillahir Rahmanir Rahim, Ya ayyuhalladhina amanu, O you who believe, kulu min at-tayyibat, eat or partake from the purities, ma razaqnakum, from what we have provided you, washkuru lillah, and be grateful to Allah, in kuntum iyyahu ta'budun, if you truly worship Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. So clearly in the siyaq, in the context of the ayah, there is a relationship between partaking in the tayyibat, actually having a wider understanding of the rizq that is coming to us, ma razaqnakum, from what has been given to you. And then we are supposed to be grateful to Allah, washkuru lillah, which we'll talk about as well inshaAllah, in kuntum iyyahu ta'budun, if, it's a conditional sentence, if you are truly obedient worshippers to Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. So if we want to have a worship of Allah, these are some requisites that are provided to us. But what is very interesting is that our expectations that are placed upon us is to live a prophetic lifestyle and not simply a lifestyle that is halal. Now when you contrast this to sort of the way in which we are living today with our consumption, I'm not saying you, but surely me and many other people out there, the way in which we consume our food and the way in which we have our diet maybe is quite in opposition to the principles of the verses that we have just read. As we mentioned earlier, Sheikh Hamza Yusuf talks about not having a fast food lifestyle. But actually, if you take a step back and you see the way in which food is presented to us, there are certain extremes that it is presented to us in. One of the extremes is sort of not just how quickly we're supposed to eat it, but how much this sort of fast food lifestyle has been integrated into our normal way of living. Just go on the high street and see how many fast food chicken shops there are. And what's really interesting during the pandemic, as you all know, You know, someone had the ingenious idea of, during a pandemic, telling us all to go and eat out in order to keep the economy going. And actually, one of the places that we were most likely to be able to pick up COVID was in those fast food places, in those restaurants. But you'll see now how quickly our economy has shifted, right? Or how much our economy is rooted in sort of this sector, and how much of it is rooted in actually the fast food world that we now live in. How quickly everything changed. The Uber Eats came to us and everything. It's now, you know, so heavily advertised to us. It's on our phones, it's on our apps. And the pride is in there in making sure that the food reaches us within 20 minutes or whatever it may be. Can you see how the lifestyle has shifted so drastically in this particular area? Or another extreme that we have, for example, is in the pricing of the food. From one perspective, the pricing of the food is expected to be as low as possible. So when you go to the chicken shops, you'll see it's, you know, 2-piece chicken and chips meal and a drink for $1.99, for example. Many of us, we don't question, or maybe now with the inflation and cost of living crisis, it's $3.99, I don't know. But we never really questioned, or many of us out there don't question, why is that food so cheap? What's going into that food that is making it so dirt cheap for us, that so many people are so quick to be able to consume? And of course, I think you know better than I what is going into those poor chickens, which we'll talk about in a minute as well, inshallah. On the other end, we actually have the other side of the extremity of how expensive food can potentially be. I'm sure you've all seen those restaurants where now literally they're putting gold shavings. Have you seen this? They're putting gold shavings onto food. Literally, they want you to be able to eat gold shavings. Have you seen those burgers that have sort of gold shaving on top of the cheese? It's a sort of fashion now that you can eat this level. There's burgers and there's things that are costing like hundreds of pounds, maybe even up to £1,000 I have seen. What would make a human being think that they can consume something that is so expensive? Can you imagine the extremities that we are going to? Or for example, we have sort of the other extremities that are there for us. But just for the sake of it, you understand. The reality is that when we say a spiritual diet, when we use this sort of term, what the Islamic perspective is that from every point of how the food is sourced and produced and cut and consumed, all of that is an integrated system. We're not looking at it from the micro perspective, but rather from the macro perspective, to understand that there is an integrated system in the way in which we are eating, and we are part of that integrated system. We are not separate from that system. And what the book actually does is try to highlight every stage of that process, from how the food is sourced to how it is consumed, and how we appreciate that food, and all of the effects that that has on the process of the diet. And we look at it from the Quranic perspective and the Ahadith that I mentioned, and then Zainari actually comments on that through the scientific literature for us to be able to merge those two things. And that was one of the goals of the text. Often we hear about how important it is for sort of Islamic scholarship and maybe secular sciences and secular scholarship to come together, to be able to work together. Normally we see that in sort of Islamic medical ethics or something like that. It was important for us that we lived, he and I, we lived that sort of mantra, and that we allowed these two worlds to be able to come together. So the spiritual diet comprises of all of the components in the food process. And I want to be able to mention a few of those, just to be able to give you a glimpse of how this work has come together and what the book actually talks about from the Quran, from the Ahadith, and from the scientific literature perspective. So one of the things that we actually mention in the book is a hadith of our seventh Imam, Musa al-Kadhim, salawatullah wa salamuhu alayh. Imam al-Kadhim alayhi salam has a wonderful hadith, and this is again in the introduction of our work. Imam al-Kadhim alayhi salam is narrated to have said the following: diet control is the fountainhead of remedies, and the stomach is the house of all ailments. So condition your body whilst it can be conditioned. So there's 3 points to this hadith. Diet control is the fountainhead of remedies. So how you control your diet is actually going to help all the remedies in your body. And the stomach is the house of all ailments. According to Imam al-Kadhim alayhi salam, principle of all of the types of ailments that we come to are through our stomach. Therefore, condition your body whilst it can be conditioned. So in this work, for example, with Zayn Ali's contribution, he actually takes those scientific studies that look at how that diet is actually the most significant cause for all of the ailments of the body that we end up having, whether it be cancer or whether it be, for example, diabetes or anything else, and how the starting point of that is actually what we consume and how much we consume it. According to the scientific literature that he provides within the book, overeating is actually the single biggest cause for the majority of the ailments that we have within our body. And thus Imam al-Kadhim alayhi salam says, diet control is the fountainhead of the remedies that we need within our body. And so, as I said, this is actually one of the starting points of the work that helps us to be able to look into the nutritional research that we did. After this, as an example, to appreciate some of the scientific literature and how it relates to the Quran and Ahadith, one of the things that Zayn Ali actually provides us is the importance of the hormone leptin. Now, I don't know how many of you have heard of the hormone leptin, which is produced by our fat cells, and it's something that communicates with our brain about the issue of the satiation of our body. And in this work, for example, he highlights how the scientific literature has done a number of double-blind studies to appreciate and understand when we eat and our mind is elsewhere, when we are, for example, watching TV or we're watching something on our phone, there is a delay in the secretion of leptin into our bodies telling us when we're actually full. So what happens is, for example, when I'm watching TV and I'm eating, because I'm distracted and I'm watching the TV, leptin is not produced at the right rate and it is delayed, which means I continue to eat, my body is actually full, but that particular hormone that was supposed to be released to tell me I'm full has not yet been released. Which means I continue to eat, filling up my stomach more than what my body can actually handle, which according to Imam al-Kadhim alayhi salam is the fountainhead of all of the problems within our diet. So it's amazing that Imam al-Kadhim alayhi salam points to this in his hadith, and just now, only in the last few years, has scientific research caught up with this and actually identified the particular hormone that needs to be released. In the work, as an example, you might find when you go to the cinema or something like that, you've got a bag of popcorn, right? And what happens is the film's going on and you're enjoying the film, and 20 minutes later the whole bag of popcorn's finished, and then you've got the nachos next to you and you're sitting, you're done. But you didn't realize that you were done and you've just been gorging on that whole extra large bag of popcorn. What made you finish that whole bag of popcorn? Because your mind has been concentrating on that film, and as a result, leptin was not produced, telling your brain that actually you're full. So this is the reason why some of this happens, in fact. Another very interesting area of research that we looked into was sort of the emotional states that we find ourselves in as we are eating, and the effect that these emotional states actually have on us. So what's very interesting is that a hadith comes to us from Amir al-Mu'mineen Ali ibn Abi Talib salawatullah wa salamuhu alayhi. Imam says, whoever wishes to spend the days of his life as a free person must not allow the greed to abide in his heart. Greed is one of those things that shackles you from being a free human being, to be able to make the own decisions that you want to be able to make. And what we look at in this work is sort of how the food industry has perfected the means of making us addicted through the salt and the sugar levels that they place within the foods. And what's interesting is that they actually advertise this to us, but we don't realize how amazing their advertising is. So for example, what was the original slogan of, I forget, Pringles? Can anyone remember the original slogan of Pringles when it came out? That's the one. Someone clearly likes their Pringles. MashaAllah. Once you pop, you can't stop. Now, it was a play, wasn't it, on words, because it was the sound of the lid coming off the Pringles tub that was the pop, but it was also the pop in the mouth, wasn't it? Once you pop, you can't stop. And the reason why you can't stop is because they have perfected the amount of salt that makes you want to continue to eat, that keeps you hungry, that keeps you thirsty, that keeps you wanting even more. So what we do in the book is that we actually go into the various different ways that they actually ensure that they keep you locked into this through an addiction, and the way in which they advertise to us to make us think that we actually need more and more, and that we don't actually realize and how some of this actually goes into the production, or some of the dangers go into the production of the foods that we eat. And what we highlight in the works from the Islamic perspective is that if you notice the hadith very subtly, it tells us that because all of these creations of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala are alive and conscious, that when they enter into the food, into the process of that food production system, when they are actually done for the sake of good, and when they are done for the sake of feeding people for the sake of goodness, these creations of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala actually submit to that, and it actually feeds into the spirituality of what we are eating. Hadith of Imam alayhi salam mentions that when an animal is being slaughtered for the sake of being for food for a mu'min, this animal gives thanks to Allah that it is actually being slaughtered for a human being that is going to do good with its energy. And so all of this goes into the food production. We also highlight its opposite through scientific literature, that when there is negative emotion or anger or greed or an ill environment that goes into the food production that you are eating, the types of effects that this has upon your body from the scientific as well as spiritual perspective. I mentioned earlier about this $1.99 chicken that you might be able to grab somewhere, maybe a few years back before the pandemic. And you know better than I the sort of industrial levels of farming that is sadly involved in the meat industries. The antibiotics that is put in, the growth hormones that are put into these chickens. And what you'll find is that there's studies, we include this in the work, there's so many exposés and studies that have been done on this particular area, where you find fields of chickens being grown, pumped into them the amount of growth hormones, and it's pumped into parts of their body to be able to make them fat. Normally it takes a certain number of weeks or months for chickens to be able to grow. But this has been reduced, and we mention this in the book, this has been reduced by such an amount that within 4 weeks, some of these chickens are ready to be harvested. Now what you'll find is that their legs have not been able to, or the meat around the legs has been pumped so quickly to grow so large, but the bones of these chickens have not been able to grow at the same pace. So what happens is that these farms, you have these chickens that are so plump, so fat, so heavy, but their legs and their bones are so thin that when they try to stand up, their legs break. So you have rows, thousands of rows of these chickens that they physically cannot move because their bodies are too fat, their legs are broken, and they're just harvested in this way, as cheaply and as quickly and as efficiently as possible. And this is what ends up in these sorts of very cheap chicken and chips places on the high street. And this is the sort of food that we as Muslims are consuming now, like everybody else is consuming out there. So again, we go through this in the literature to be able to show you the exposés, the scientific literature, and the effects that it has upon our spirituality as well. Another example of what we try to highlight in the work is something quite unique that Ayatollah al-Modarresi does so magnificently in his works. And what he does is that he brings together much of the source literature from disparate works and brings them into one place. So you have sort of a very fluid construction of the idea of diet and nutrition. And what we find within the work is that Ayatollah al-Modarresi actually lays out the sequence that it is recommended for us to be able to eat in the Islamic literature. That's how detailed our Islamic literature goes. That when we sit at the table, what we should eat first, what we should eat second, and so on and so forth. So I'll give you an example of what is mentioned within the work. So we start with, for example, the Ahadith of the Prophet sallallahu alaihi wasallam, the supplication that he used to recite when the table was laid in front of him. The Prophet is narrated to have recited, Subhanaka Allahumma ma ahsana ma tabtalina, Subhanaka ma akthara ma tu'atina. Glory be to you, Allah. How wonderful is that which you have tested us with. Glory be to you, how plentiful you have given to us. And then we go to the next stage, for example, how to sit with people and the importance of the social element according to the Ahadith. Beginning in the name of Allah, beginning with a pinch of salt, for example. And then we look, Ayatollah al-Modarresi extrapolates from Surah al-Waqi'ah the order that we are supposed to eat our food by. So he does this by reflecting on the order of the food that is going to be presented to you in Jannah, and argues that if this by priority is how the food is going to be presented in the purity of Jannah, then of course bil awlawiyya, by priority, this is how the food should be eaten in dunya. So he mentions this in the following verses. Chapter number 56, Surah Al-Waqi'ah, from verse number 15. Bismillah ar-Rahman ar-Rahim. Ala sururim mawdhuna, seated on gold encrusted couches. Muttaki'ina alayha mutaqabilin, reclining on them face to face. Yatufu alayhim wildanum mukhalladun, immortal youths shall go around them serving them. What will be given to us first in Jannah, insha'Allah? بِأَكْوَابٍ وَأَبَارِيقَ وَكَأْسٍ مِّن مَّعِينٍ, goblets and cups filled with drinks from running springs. So he extrapolates that this is the first thing that we should be having on our table. We should drink first. لَا يُصَدَّعُونَ عَنْهَا وَلَا يُنْزِفُونَ, a drink by which their minds will not be clouded, nor will it cause drunkenness. What happens next? What are you given next in Jannah? وَفَاكِهَةٍ مِّمَّا يَتَخَيَّرُونَ, and they will serve you these fruits from whatever you want to be able to choose. So he says the first thing that you should be eating is fruits. And you know, there are actually some traditions, some cultures that you actually will be served fruits first. If you go to Iran, it is quite common that the first thing that they will serve you is fruits, and then they will bring out the main meal. وَفَاكِهَةٍ مِّمَّا يَتَخَيَّرُونَ, and then comes وَلَحْمِ طَيْرٍ مِّمَّا يَشْتَهُونَ, and then you will be served the flesh of any animal that you desire to be able to eat. So Ayatollah al-Modarresi, for example, in the order that we are supposed to eat, he goes into these sorts of details as well. And then there's many, many more. For example, the supplication that you're supposed to recite at the end of eating the meal. For example, our sixth Imam, as-Sadiq, salawatullah wa salamuhu alayh, would conclude his meal with the following statement: Alhamdulillah alladhi at'amana fi ja'i'in wa saqana fi dhamanin wa kasana fi 'arin wa hadana fi dhalin wa hamalna fi rajilin wa awana fi dhajin wa akhdimna fi 'anin wa faddalna ala kathirin min al-'alimin. All praise belongs to Allah, who fed us in our hunger and gave us to drink during our thirst and clothed us when we were bare, guided us during misguidance, carried us when being pedestrian, and was lenient to us during our boisterousness and attended to us during our struggles, and who favored us over many in the world. The point we make here is that the work tries to bring together the scientific literature, the moral literature, as well as the traditional literature, and bring it into one place from a Shi'i perspective, which, to my understanding, this is the first work available to us of this nature. And so we wanted to be able to present this work to you in the hope that it may be of benefit to you and I, and in the hope that we will be able to purify our own diets and our own tables from what we are able to eat from, insha'Allah. I want to be able to conclude with maybe one or two lines of gham, as we are in the days of remembering Sayyidah Zainab alayha salam in the times of Kufa and Sham. In one of the narrations it says that Sayyidah Kulthum alayha salam in the city of Kufa gave a sermon that was to cause the Sabaya, the captives, to be able to depart very quickly from Kufa. They were in Kufa maybe up to 3 days and no more. And that was because there was such a tumult in Kufa that Ubaidullah ibn Ziyad had to force them to leave and made them go on the journey across Lebanon into Syria and into Damascus. According to the narration, it says that as the captives were being paraded through the city of Kufa, Sayyidah Kulthum started to give a sermon in which a narration says from Imam as-Sadiq alayhi salam that she gave such a powerful sermon that it was as if Ali ibn Abi Talib himself had spoken. This is how powerful Sayyidah Kulthum's statements were. And in this statement she says, "Do you not know that your men are killing us, whilst you women are lamenting and crying over us? Whilst you're crying, literally your men are killing us at this moment in time." Upon this, the women had become so aware of what they had done, they started to come and give some food to the captives. They started to give them maybe some seeds and some dates. And at this moment, as they began to feed the children of Ahlul Bayt alayhimus salam, Sayyidah Kulthum snatched the food away and said, "Don't you know Sadaqa haramun alayna? Sadaqa is haram for us Ahlul Bayt alayhimus salam. We are not supposed to be treated like this. We are supposed to be treated in a more grander way." According to one narration, when the captives were forced to leave Kufa, one of the cities that they were paraded through was the city of Aleppo, which is the city in which Prophet Yahya alayhi salam was killed. He was beheaded. And the narration says that in the very same location that Prophet Yahya alayhi salam was beheaded, and the same location that Imam al-Hussein alayhi salam's head was placed, one of the women of Ahlul Bayt alayhimus salam lost her child on that place. When Sayyidah Kulthum says, "Your men are killing us and your women are lamenting over us," what does she mean by this? One narration says that one of the women was in that location, and due to the anxiety or due to the tortures that were upon her, she lost her child in that very same place that Prophet Yahya alayhi salam was beheaded. ألا لعنة الله على القوم الظالمين وسيعلم الذين ظلموا أي منقلب ينقلبون إنا لله وإنا إليه راجعون. We ask Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala to hasten the appearance of Imam al-Mahdi alayhi salam, to allow us to be alongside him at all times in our life and in our death. If we were to pass away from this world before his coming, Ya Allah, raise us so that we can partake in the victories of Muhammad and Ali Muhammad. Ya Allah, help us to be able to purify our diets and our environments such that we can live hayatun tayyibah and reach the expectations of living a prophetic life, and help us inshaAllah to do justice to the food that we consume, and help us inshaAllah to become the very best versions of ourselves, and grant us the ziyarat of Sayyidah Kulthum in the city of Medina al-Munawwarah, and the ziyarah of Sayyidah Zainab alayha salam in Damascus. Walhamdulillah Rabbil Alameen, wa salli ya Rabbi ala Muhammadin wa alihi at-tahirin.
So we have some time for questions, if there are any questions from either side.
Assalamu alaikum.
Wa alaykum salam.
I'd just like to ask, you said very good starters with fruit and then meat. What is the dessert? Because our Asian people, we have sev, you know, because we usually, Asian people, we should dive into our meat. No soup. European, they have starters, main meal, dessert. Yeah, but with us, with our culture, Asian, whether it's Khojas, Pakistani, you know, we love our meat excessively, but nothing is mentioned about fish. Why? Fish is supposed to be less fattening.
Ahsan, very kind, very well pointed out. So in the work, earlier on I mentioned that we've gone through to certain extremities, right? One of the extremities of our age, especially in the Indo-Pak subcontinent, is that the most important thing in our meal is the taste of the meal and not necessarily the nutritional value of the meal. Now, where has that come from? Actually, that's come to us from the Mughal Empire. Because when the Mughal kings, I mean, I don't know how much we know about this, but, you know, it was more about the taste of the food since then. And they wanted us to be able to find any particular meal that we could possibly create so that the kings were satiated. This is how we came up with the sort of meals that we have living with us until today. Maybe the biryanis and everything else that comes with us today. We have to ask ourselves, where does that actually come from? It actually starts in the Mughal Empire. And that was there to satiate the kings. Anyway, so our communities often pay more attention to what we can fry and, you know, how much meat is in our diet. And even in our mosques and imam barghas and masajids, you know, it's more important for us to be able to serve a meat-based diet, meat-based foods on kushali or whatever, than it is something which is more green. Now, from the perspective of the Ahadith, it is well known that meat was consumed irregularly by the Prophet sallallahu alaihi wasallam. The narration, for example, says that, and we quote this in the work, that it was only once every 40 days that you would see smoke coming from the house of the Prophet, which is an indication to how irregularly meat was cooked. That's the meaning of the hadith. And it's very well popularized that the Prophet maybe only had meat once every 40 days, or there or thereabouts. It's not to say that he wouldn't have more unnecessarily. Of course he would, if there was opportune time. But you can see the principle that the Prophet had. We reject the hadith that says that fish is supposed to be consumed once a week on Wednesdays. We find this to be a weak narration, and we don't accept it, and we don't put it in the book. We find that this is something that was maybe just created maybe by a fishmonger or something to be able to help that person's pocket. Maybe. Say again? No, it's Wednesday. Yeah, according to the narration, it's Wednesday, but we reject the hadith. So we don't include it in the... And there's many hadith that we don't include in the book because we don't find them to be correct. So the Prophet had a plant-based diet, for sure, and he had a very sparsely meat-based diet. Now, what's very interesting is that the companions never realized the extent of the prophetic wisdom until the Prophet told them about this. The narration says, for example, this is found in both Sunni and Shi'i traditions, the Prophet sallallahu alaihi wasallam went berry picking with the companions, and he actually showed them which berries they should eat and should not eat, i.e., which were more ripe and less ripe. And then he explained this one is better for this sort of ailment, or this one is better for this sort of issue. And they were so surprised. And then the Prophet famously says, not a prophet has been raised, but that he was a shepherd, except one. And that prophet was a tailor, a khayyat. So he highlights that it was the prophetic model to be raised on a very green-based diet, plant-based diet, and that's what's actually expected of us. So we talk at length about this in the work, about the shift or the need for the shift to a plant-based diet, well away from a meat-based diet. And what we actually do in the work is many actual drawings. What you'll find in the work has been specifically created so that you can write your notes in it. At the end of every section we have notes so that you can make your own notes. But then we actually have sections where you can look at your own diet. So, for example, we explain, how the molecules are, and the healthy fats, and we look at what things are supposed to be in the nutritious diet. We make it easy for people, and then I'm trying to find where it is. We talk about the importance of recycling. The so much plastics that come in the foods. We talk about that as well as part of the holistic diet. And then we talk about eating the rainbow and how you should have all of these different colors in your food. Now, one of the goals of this work was that it was very child-friendly. And the target audience, not to be sexist, please forgive me, but the target audience is actually young mothers. Why? Because we wanted young mothers and their children to read this work together and to think about having a better diet together. There's a wonderful work by Sister Nazmina Nazmina Dunji, 50 Quranic comforts for mothers. And the style of the work is clearly, the form of the work is dedicated to a target audience. We looked at her work, and when we designed the work, we based it on her work. Ideally reaching young mums and their children so that they can do this together. That's why we talk about eating the rainbow, and that children should identify what they are eating by the colors, i.e. that match the fruits and the vegetables that are supposed to be in their diet. So we heavily emphasize a shift away from meat-based diet to a plant-based diet.
Because a lot of the media ridicule us. So Muslim people are heavy meat eaters. And our meat consumption in this country is the highest, more than the English and everything.
There's a very well-known statistic that says that after Eid, this is the biggest time that you will see Muslims in A&E having heart attacks, because the whole month of Ramadan, even though it's supposed to be about spiritual dieting, is the time when we eat the most amount of fatty and fried foods. It's actually a fact that the first month after Eid, you will see the most number of Muslims in A&E having heart attacks. So
maybe because Hijaz was mostly desert, we didn't have proper.
Well, they had horses, they had sheep, they had camels.
They fish. That's why Allah in Jannah doesn't talk about fish.
Well, Yunus alayhi salam made his way into a very big whale, so there was definitely some fish available to him.
Sheikh Jaffer, thank you.
My honor.
A question which we face in many other disciplines as well, and this one, is what is the difference between halal and tayyib? So, for example, I ask my students, can you become obese on halal junk food?
Yes.
If you can, is it halal?
Ahsan. So this is something that we wrangle with in the introduction, the preface of the text. And we try to explain that halal is a fiqhi standard and tayyib is a spiritual standard. So from the fiqhi perspective, you can easily perform the zabiha, for example, and you will fulfill all the conditions for it to be slaughtered in a halal way. But as we mentioned, for example, that the animal may have been pumped with hormones, the environment in which it has been living in for its very short 6-week lifespan has been murderous and has been a really terrible environment, and that's what we're consuming. So technically it may be halal, but by no means at all is it tayyib. So when we begin to define tayyib, we define tayyib by every process that goes into the consumption. Now, because we're not talking about tayyib from other perspective, we're looking specifically from the perspective of consumption. We talk about how it is planted or how it's grown, the environment in which it is grown, how it is slaughtered, whether it was happy or not when it was slaughtered, how it has reached us. We even talk about how it is cooked or whom does the cooking. And then the social environment. We have a whole chapter of ahadith where the Prophet and the Imams talk about the importance of eating food socially and the benefits of having guests or not eating, like the kiraha of eating on your own. And how it is highly mustahab al-mu'akkadat for us to be able to eat socially, at least with one person. To the extent that the Prophet said that wait. If you're eating and you could potentially eat this on your own and you could wait for someone to join you, wait and then eat later when someone's joining you. All of this is what we define as being tayyib. It's the whole cycle that goes into the consumption of the food and not just the food itself.
So then does it become haram if it is not tayyib?
Well, this is actually, because all of us have slightly different levels of expectation upon ourselves, the higher the level of expectation upon yourself, you'll no longer be within the rigid sort of, ahkam al-khamsa that says this is haram and this is makruh and this is mubah. You will say that what is spiritually required of you is this, and me dropping below it is haram upon myself. So that's sort of one of the goals of the work, is to raise the standards by which we are eating from, so that no longer we just consider it from the halal perspective, but tayyib becomes the standard. Dropping below that becomes haram upon us, inshallah.
Thank you very much. When you say there's traditional input, is that traditionally Islamically or ethnically?
Traditionally Islamically. So because Ayatollah al-Modarresi goes through the Quran and the Ahadith and compiles them from what he considers to be sound or workable hadith, it starts with that tradition. And then in my commentaries, I stick to the tradition as well. So I will add ayat and ahadith where he may not have, to be able to buttress that work. And then Zayn Ali focuses solely on the scientific side and the moral side, and we bring that together.
Thank you.
So everything has three. So we have the original text by Sayyid al-Modarresi, and then we have my commentary and Zayn Ali's commentary merged into one on top of it. So you'll always find it, his work, and then our work is commentating on it afterwards, in the style.
It's just I was interested if it was any sort of input with Ayurvedic or sattvic dietary requirements in that.
So we tried not to focus on any specific ethnicity because we wanted to make it as universal as possible. But we do draw on good examples from other communities as well. For example, there's the famous Kobe diet from Japan that actually has the longest living people, I think average of more than 100 years old till date. We look at even, for example, the Buddhist practice. I don't know if you know this. Buddhist monks in their temples, it is a tradition that they would nominate the most spiritually gifted person to be the chef of the monastery. Why? Because the spirituality of that person is into the spirituality of the food that everybody would participate in. So it's something that's universal, is the point that we're making. The idea of spirituality in food is something across all traditions.
Okay, there are 4 people who've got questions, so if we can try and keep each of them quite short so we can get to all of them, and then we can finish, that would be great. No.
And then we can all finish with a McDonald's or a KFC. Yeah?
Okay.
Assalamu alaikum.
Wa alaikum salam.
Thank you so much for your talk. I was just wondering, also building on Iqbal Uncle's comment on tayyib, and whether you looked into kind of the sustainability of farming, because as you know now, specifically all the meat we eat in the UK, I mean, it's definitely not sustainable.
Yes.
And you spoke a lot about kind of, you know, the treatment of animals, etc. But actually, you know, lots of studies have shown that when we look at free-range meat, that's actually less sustainable, more kind of, you know, it's got a larger carbon footprint, etc. in terms of, in terms of farming practices.
We mentioned sustainability on 3 different occasions, and it is a part of the work, but sadly it's not the forefront of the work. One of the works that we're trying to do at the moment is actually about sort of offering it's an environmental work that I'm trying to bring to the fore, and in that work, inshallah, we'll focus more on the sustainability and the carbon footprint. Dad gets very upset with me, but I do try to suggest that we all but remove, if possible, meat from our diets. Arguably, the single biggest contributor to global warming at the moment is the meat industry, because of the amount of methane that is being produced. And this has further impacts on sort of the water consumption as well that is going into producing and sustaining all these animals. So we mention it briefly in this work, but inshallah in our next work we'll focus on it, and we debate the fiqhi mas'ala on if this is the largest dhar, the largest potential harm to humanity. And the Prophet sallallahu alaihi wasallam said, "La dharar wa la dhirar." Islam forbids harm coming to you. Does that potentially make meat consumption in this era temporarily haram? So it's a mas'ala that we touch on and I go through what some of the ideas of the Maraji and Mujtahideen. You know, Miqdad recently done a wonderful series of blogs on Sheikh Haydar Hubbullah. Actually, I sat with Sheikh Haydar on this mas'ala and asked him for his opinion on whether we could potentially make eating meat in this period temporarily haram if it is the largest dhar to human civilization. So maybe inshallah keep an eye out for that one. Yeah, well.
I have to migrate.
Yeah.
Thank you. Sheikh Jaffer, thank you so much for bringing Alaikum Salam wa Rahmatullah. So much for bringing such a topical issue to the fore, and the other great works that you're involved in. Specifically on this subject, something that has been a passion of mine growing up is the advice that Imam Rida offers to Mamun of the day of Risalat al-Dhahabiyya in terms of the fruits in season.
Yes.
Now, fruits on demand, you walk into Tesco's and there's pineapples 365 days, the food miles, but the effect that has on the body, consuming pineapples which have grown in the tropical countries in the midst of a winter day in Britain, let alone the harm that that causes to the environment, let alone the poverty that it creates on a cash economy there, where they're, you know, given very little, the price of the goods are really compressed there. Roll forward, that was my childhood in Mombasa, where I came across that work. Rolling forward 5 or 7 years from there, sitting in a classroom with Iqbal uncle, taking current affairs and telling us the economy of conversion from wheat to meat and what that meant for the countries. Now, today, I sit there and question that when food aid is given post-disaster, what are the kind of considerations that we're making for the changing environment and extremes in weather being the norm? Are we trying to replicate the kind of foods that we would eat here and the nutritional advice that we give here for communities that are more susceptible to that? And are they looking at Qurbani animals? Because Eid al-Adha is coming and you'll have to have so many thousands of sheep murdered on one day just so that people can satisfy the desire elsewhere? Or can we, from that perspective, say, here is a plot of land for you to cultivate and make your food supply more resilient to climate extremes? So sorry, it's been a bit of a cacophony of questions and ideas, but the main issue here is the food miles, the local growth, the respect to the environment, because appreciating that the body is your internal ecosystem, but there's a wider ecosystem out there that our food will harm or benefit.
So, firstly, I feel like the question is far more substantive as an answer than it is as a question. It was a leading question. And secondly, I think you're in a better position to be able to answer at least half of that question when you talk about sort of food urgency or sort of responding to disaster and the need to be able to respond in a balanced way for a global economy. So that's not something that's in my expertise. It's certainly within yours, and I feel that you would be better placed to answer that. Responding to the book, or at least telling what the book addresses, two things come to mind. The first is the plethora of narrations that reach us that say, have this, and this will be, eat this because it is the best fruit, or eat this and it will give you this relief from this ailment. And as you know, in sort of Tibb al-Rida or Tibb al-A'imma, alayhimus salam, that is actually there. So we try to address whether those are specifics or whether those are principles as part of a green diet. And we argue that because a lot of these things are not available to all people, it could not have necessarily been a universal, but it has to be something that's part of a healthy diet. Now, sometimes the ahadith are very specific. Hadith from Imam Sadiq alayhi salam says, eat apples, for in it is a cure for everything, for example. So we have to then try to balance the understanding between the generality of the narration. For example, a general narration that we use as part of a diet and not part of a specific. Imam alayhi salam says, eat spring onions because nothing is revealed from the heavens in the morning or the evenings quite like spring onions. Now, was that someone interpolating that into the narration, or is that something that we have to take literally, or was the Imam saying that this is something that's part of a good diet for you? So in this case, we've erred on the idea that this is not a specific, this is a general, right? Now, what we highlight in the book is something very interesting that I might need you then to come back and comment on. We highlighted an American study that in 2012, there were 4,900 different cereals available to the consumer. Now just think about that. When you walk into Tesco and Asda, how many different cereals? It's the same thing, isn't it? But how many different flavors, how many different brands, obviously they have varying levels of nutrition, varying different levels of whatever, sugar, but principally it's the same thing. How many different types of chocolates are there? How many different types of crisps are there? We are inundated with choice to meet every single type of taste that we had imagined and never even had imagined. What is the consequence of that level of production on sustainability, as the sister asked, and also going back to the sort of question that you've asked? Is it sustainable to have 4,900 different types of cereal in one country? Or is that something that to produce that has caused such an imbalance in the global share of, let's say, available water, available wheat that has to be grown, and the amount that, let's say, the United States dumps into the ocean every year in order to be able to keep the commodity at a certain level, at a certain value? And then we buy into that because we think, whoa, I've got all this choice. MashaAllah, I walk in, I've got all this choice. Well, this week I want to buy Alpen, and this week I want to buy Kellogg's, and I want to buy Wheatos. But actually, it's not sustainable for us. So that's my thinking when it comes back to the question about the fruits that you asked. I'm not sure that we're able to sustain this much more than a decade. And after that, it's potentially societal collapse. Making that change. Being a bit more narrow. As I was saying, the Prophet's diet was more about specific choices. The Prophet's diet was making specific choices in what was healthy for him, what was healthy for the environment around him, sustainable for the environment around him, and not what was most pleasing to the palate. In fact, the hadith, one that's very interesting for you to be able to take away from this, Imam Sadiq alayhi salam is a hadith where he's actually in the midst of a famine in Medina, and he actually says to his own servant, sell the good food that we have to everybody else in Medina, because we cannot eat plush food whilst everybody else eats ordinary food. So the Imam would lower what he would do, his level of what he would intake, to make sure that he was in line with what everybody else could have available to them. So these are very instructive narrations that are available for us about prophetic lifestyle, or hayatun tayyiba.
Okay. Still there'll be more questions. People with their hand up. We'll just take the last one there.
Assalamu alaikum.
Wa alaikum salam.
This food that obviously is reduced in price is so that people can afford to buy it. Now you're saying don't have this food, this chicken or whatever. So I mean they've reduced the price so that people can actually afford it. Otherwise they'll go hungry. So that's the reason why they've done these things, yeah? And then again, going back to the Prophet, hang on, let's go back to the Prophet
the economist
itself.
Needs to answer this better than me.
Let's look at the Prophet itself. Yeah, I mean, in those days, did he have all of this? They didn't even have clean water, let alone all these things that you mentioned. It looks very far-fetched to me. They used to have, from the camels' things and whatever, the skin and things like that. So these are the sort of things they used to eat in those days. They obviously got changed and everything else. So how can you mention so that it's so much?
Say that last part again.
Look, the Prophet at the time of his life, yeah. So I'm really questioning whether did he have all of these stuff that you mentioned? Did he have all of I think they didn't have that much food. Even the water that they consumed wasn't necessarily as now here you get such clean water in bottles and God knows what. I think they are very hygienic and things like that. I'm not sure if they had them in those days. I'm questioning that really.
So I'm just going back to some very rudimentary history studies and thinking about for thousands of years there have been great efforts to understand sort of the cycles of our human waste going into, say, rivers and oceans. There's been plenty of studies that have done that on that, whether it be in the Nile or whether it be even in the Thames. And I think that this sort of the idea of making sure that there was clean water was very much at the forefront of their ideology, because at that point you had the introduction of clean water, mudaf water, and all the different definitions of mudaf water that would go into the issues of wudu. So this was very much at the forefront, because even in the annals of fiqh they talk about sort of animals dying in wells, animals dying in small reservoirs, and how much water you had to take out, how much you had to purify water. So this was a very lengthy thing that was normal for the Arabs to already have. So I would respond in a little bit by saying that this was normalized there according to early literature, early Islamic literature. But going back to the first question, I think that's a very interesting one, especially considering the cost of living crisis that is being thrown upon us at the moment by our far-right government. We have to realize that there is a lot of work that is going into, a lot of charitable work that has gone into helping families think about how to make the most nutritious meal from the least amount of money available to them. I used to work with a charity in Bristol when I was here in Hujjat Stanmore. I used to work with a charity in Bristol, specifically Muslims, and they, in schools, would rent out, in schools there's, they teach, what we used to learn, what was it called? What was that? Home economics? Yeah? So when we used to learn home economics, you obviously had kitchens, number of kitchens, and you used to learn how to cook. They still have those in some schools. So you would rent those out from the schools, and they take the most socioeconomically deprived children in the area. Most likely their parents are out working because they need 2 to 3 jobs to sustain themselves. Or they have to have sort of microwave meals, and they teach those children how to be able to cook the most nutritious meals available to them for the lowest cost. So there is a shift in society to move away from this fast food and put that $2.99, that $3.99, instead of into chicken and chips and a Pepsi, into something that is much more nutritious for them. So as I said, Muslims are participating in this, and they're doing it with non-Muslim children. And I think that there is much scope for us to be able to expand that work, especially in London or in other socially economically deprived areas of the country.
Thank you very, very much. And I know there are other questions, but we have to end this. So, Salaat ala Muhammad wa ala Muhammad.
Allahumma salli ala Muhammad.
Inshallah, you're around for a few minutes afterwards.
Yes, inshallah. And the book is there as well.
And I was going to say the book is here at the back. And Jaffer said you can find it also on www.iph.ca, Islamic Publishing House, and you can purchase it from there as well as at the back. So inshallah, if you speak to them directly, we'll end there. Salaat ala Muhammad wa ala
Allahumma salli ala Muhammad wa ali Muhammad.